two frightened little girls sold like livestock by the woman meant to protect them. But fate had other plans. One desperate man and a single moment that would unravel secrets buried deep in silence. In a world where power hides truth, can love uncover what greed tried to erase? What will become the fate of these girls? It all began in a quiet neighborhood where a wealthy man lived with his beloved wife and their twin daughters, Jane and Jessica. They were a picture of happiness. Laughter echoed through marble halls. The girls played in lush gardens, and their father spared no expense to give his family the best of everything. But money couldn't protect them from tragedy. When the girls were just 4 years old, their mother died unexpectedly. Her death shattered the household. The mansion, once full of joy, became a hollow shell of its former self. Their father, though rich in wealth, was suddenly poor in spirit. He poured his time and energy into raising Jane and Jessica, clinging to the last pieces of the woman he loved. A year later, in a desperate attempt to rebuild his broken home, he remarried a lady named Lucy. To the outside world, Lucy was elegant, well-spoken, and graceful. But behind her charming smile was a heart hardened by greed. She didn't marry for love. She saw an opportunity. A wealthy widower with no prenuptial agreement and 2 young children in the way of her inheritance. Jane and Jessica, innocent and eager to be loved, tried to embrace their new stepmother. But behind closed doors, Lucy showed them no kindness. She was cold, calculating, and often cruel. Still, the girls never told their father. They feared being seen as troublemakers, and deep down, they still hoped she might change. But then, the unthinkable happened. Their father, who had been quietly battling a serious illness, passed away in his sleep. The mansion grew darker that day, not just with grief, but with Lucy's looming intentions. While pretending to mourn, Lucy quickly found the will, the document that revealed the twins were the sole heirs to their father's immense fortune. Furious, she didn't destroy it. She hid it. Carefully, she tucked it away, vowing to claim the money for herself once she figured out how to eliminate the last obstacle, Jane and Jessica. With no close relatives to intervene and no one to ask questions, Lucy's mask slipped completely. She no longer pretended to care. The girls were nothing more than keys to a locked treasure chest she couldn't open. So, she made a horrifying decision. She would sell them, not to another family, not through adoption, but through someone that would sell them at a public auction in a crowded market on the outskirts of town, disguised as helping orphans find homes. It was a place no one with status would ever dare visit, far from the wealth and eyes of the elite. On that faithful day, a single father named Dave had come to pick up materials for his carpentry work. Life hadn't been easy for him. He wasn't wealthy. He worked long hours, scraping by, but his heart was rich with kindness. He never planned on stopping at the auction. But as he walked past, he heard a small voice, a little girl whispering to her sister, "Maybe this time, someone kind will take us." He turned, and there they were. Jane and Jessica, dressed in hand-me-downs, standing quietly as the dealer waved off bids like a merchant haggling over livestock. Dave's heart broke. He stepped forward, not knowing their names, their story, or how deep this moment would change his life. He only knew 2 little girls didn't deserve to be treated like property. "I'll take them," he said. He offered more than anyone else. Not just money, but protection. And in that moment, without knowing it, he became the key to unlocking a hidden, buried secret and a destiny far greater than any of them could imagine. Dave had never been a man of wealth, but he was rich in ways gold couldn't measure. A widower and carpenter by trade, he spent his days working with his hands and his evenings raising his 10-year-old son, Peter, in a small but sturdy home on the edge of town. Life hadn't been easy. Peter's mother had died when he was just a toddler, and since then, father and son had leaned on each other through every storm. Though Dave was worn by years of labor, he carried a quiet strength and a heart that still believed in doing right, even when the world did wrong. So when he saw the twin girls, thin, silent, and hollow-eyed, being auctioned like cattle at the market, something inside him broke. He didn't hesitate. Not because he needed more mouths to feed, and certainly not because he could afford it, but because no child deserved to be treated like that, especially not by the cold woman who called herself their guardian. He stepped forward, paid the sum asked, and left with the girls. Not as property, but as someone determined to protect them. Jane and Jessica sat quietly in the wagon as Dave guided the horse home. They clutched each other's hands, unsure of what awaited them next. But the air felt different now, gentler. For the first time in a long while, no one was shouting. No one was cruel. When they reached the house, Peter was out front, hammering a plank back into the chicken coop. He looked up, curious, as his father helped the girls down from the wagon. "These are Jane and Jessica," Dave said simply. "They'll be staying with us now." Peter, quiet like his father but keen-eyed, nodded. All right. That evening, they shared a meal of warm bread, stew, and boiled potatoes by the fire. Jane ate slowly, glancing between bites to make sure no one would take her bowl away. Jessica kept her spoon clutched tight in her hand, as if it might disappear. Dave noticed but said nothing. He simply ladled out seconds when they were ready. Peter, ever observant, scooted the girls closer to the fire without a word. Over the next few days, the girls moved cautiously through the little home. They flinched at loud sounds. They whispered instead of speaking, but gradually they began to breathe. Dave took time each morning to show them simple tasks: how to sweep the porch, how to carry water from the well, how to sand the edges of a wooden stool. It was Jessica who first asked about his tools, and Jane who dared to help hold the nails. Peter, once a lonely boy with no siblings, now found his world fuller. He taught them how to feed the hens and where the wild berries grew near the stream. He carved them little wooden dolls in secret and slipped them under their pillows. Dave made it official within the week. He rode to town, visited the magistrate, and filed papers to have the girls registered under his care. They were now, by law and by heart, his dependents. At night, laughter began to return to the small home. Jessica giggled when Peter tried to balance spoons on his nose. Jane smiled when Dave read aloud from the Bible by lantern light. And for the first time, the twins started to sleep through the night without waking from nightmares. They weren't healed, not yet, but they were safe. And in the warmth of that wooden house, tucked beneath quilts stitched by hands that cared, Jane and Jessica began to believe something they hadn't dared to hope in a long time. But something troubled his mind. How will he be able to afford taking care of the girls and his son? How is he going to provide their basic needs of his children? Back at the grand estate, time had done little to warm the halls. The mansion stood tall but hollow, stripped of its former joy. Lucy now lived alone, surrounded by wealth but untouched by peace. The laughter of children was long gone, replaced by silence and the barking of her prize dogs, who now roamed the house freely. One morning, she stood in the doorway of her late husband's study, wrinkling her nose at the dust and disuse. The office had sat untouched since the day he died, its shelves still lined with his books, the heavy desk sitting exactly where he left it. "This would make a perfect room for the dogs," she muttered, already picturing velvet beds and brass bowls. She needed a carpenter, someone quiet, efficient, and cheap. The name Dave Callan came up through a stable hand who'd had repairs done. She didn't bother to check further. Days later, Dave arrived with his tool bag slung over his shoulder, unaware of the history behind the gates he now passed through. He'd taken the job without hesitation. Work was work, and coin was coin. Lucy barely glanced at him when he arrived, waving him toward the study with a curt, "Do what you must. I want it cleared and ready for flooring." Dave entered the office and paused. It smelled of old paper and fading memory. Dust danced in the shafts of sunlight streaming through the high windows. Though he didn't recognize the home, something about the silence pressed strangely on his chest. He set to work. He cleared the floor, swept years of dust from the shelves, and began dismantling part of the bookcase that needed reinforcing. As he knelt beside the old oak, tapping gently to find the loose joints, something clicked. A hollow sound. He paused. Tapping again, he found a sealed drawer disguised behind a panel, neatly crafted, almost invisible. He pried it open with care. the wood stiff from years of stillness. Inside was a single envelope, yellowed at the edges but sealed with a dark red wax. Written in a firm hand were the words, "For my daughters, in case of my passing." Dave's breath caught. He turned the envelope over in his hands, staring at the name signed across the seal. It matched the name that had once been whispered between two frightened little girls, now safe in his home. He slowly opened the letter. Inside was the will, clearly written and notarized. There, in ink that had barely faded, was the truth. Every piece of the estate, every coin, every asset had been left to Jane and Jessica. Not Lucy, not anyone else. To the twins. His hands trembled slightly as he set the will back in its envelope, his mind racing not with greed, but with justice. The girls had lived in fear, had been sold like animals. And all along, their father's last wish, his love, written plainly on parchment, had been hidden, buried, forgotten. Until now. Dave stood in the room, quiet and still, the ghosts of the past thick around him. Sunlight filtered across the envelope in his hand like a quiet spotlight. Contemplating his next move, how is he going to bring the evil stepmother to justice? Dave stood still for a long time in that room. The will, now safely tucked in the inner pocket of his work coat, weighed heavier than any timber beam he'd ever hoisted. It wasn't just paper. It was a father's dying wish, a beacon of truth buried beneath dust and deceit. And Jane and Jessica, those two brave, gentle girls sleeping under his roof, had been robbed of it. As the sun dipped low behind the trees, he packed up his tools and left the estate in silence, nodding stiffly as Lucy dismissed him with barely a word. He didn't let on. Not yet. But the fire was building behind his ribs. That evening, after settling the children for bed, Dave sat by the hearth, the will open on the table before him. He pulled out Old Town records and estate papers, documents he had access to through his carpentry work, receipts, property listings, and maps. Everything matched. The names, the legal seal, the signature of the town magistrate. It was the girl's home. The next morning, with the envelope protected inside a hand-carved lockbox, Dave hitched his wagon and rode into town. His first stop was the modest office of Samuel Wright, a longtime friend and a trusted lawyer who had once helped Dave secure Peter's birth records after his wife's death. Samuel was a wiry man with spectacles always too close to the edge of his nose. When Dave placed the will on his desk, he read in silence for several long minutes. Finally, he looked up, his voice low but clear. "This is genuine. Ink, seal, signature, all of it holds. If this was hidden intentionally, it's not just immoral. It's criminal." Dave nodded grimly. "The woman who hid it, she sold the girls, Sam. Sold them at an auction. Like livestock." Samuel's eyes widened with horror. "Good Lord, that's trafficking, Dave. And with a suppressed will? This needs to go to the sheriff. Today." They wasted no time. By noon, Dave stood before Sheriff Tully, a broad-shouldered man with a reputation for fairness and a grudge against injustice. Tully listened intently as Dave laid everything bare, from the moment he first saw the girls at the auction to the sealed drawer in the mansion. He showed the will, and Samuel vouched for its authenticity. Tully stood up with a quiet nod, adjusted his hat, and said, "That woman's about to meet the law she thought she could dance around." By that evening, Lucy's gates were swung open not for carriages, but for deputies with warrants in hand. She protested at first, demanding to see a judge, calling Dave a liar. But the moment the sheriff laid the will on her velvet-lined parlor table, all color drained from her face. "You were never meant to have this house," he said, "and you sure as hell weren't meant to sell those girls." Lucy was arrested on the spot for child trafficking, fraud, and will suppression. Her dogs barked wildly as she was taken out, but none of the servants intervened. Some even watched with barely hidden relief. The trial followed swiftly. Word spread through the town like wildfire, and in the courthouse gallery, whispers of Lucy's wickedness reached every corner. Dave testified calmly, recounting how he found Jane and Jessica and how the will had been hidden. Samuel presented the document to the magistrate, its ink still vivid, the seal unbroken until Dave opened it. Jane and Jessica, too young to understand the full weight of the courtroom, sat quietly beside Peter in the front row, clutching each other's hands. Their eyes never left Dave, who glanced back at them often with a quiet, reassuring nod. The court ruled swiftly and firmly. The will was valid. The fortune, every acre of land, every coin in the estate, every deed and asset, belonged to Jane and Jessica. Lucy was sentenced to 20 years in prison, her crimes declared heinous and calculated. She left the courthouse in shackles, her legacy of cruelty now fully exposed. But the magistrate didn't stop there. He turned to Dave and said, "Mr. Dave, you rescued these girls from a fate no child should endure. You sheltered them, clothed them, gave them safety, and came forward with truth when you could have walked away. By this court's authority, and with the support of your legal counsel, you are hereby granted full legal guardianship of Jane and Jessica Brooks." Dave's eyes burned, not with pride, but with quiet emotion. He tipped his head low, murmuring, "Thank you, sir." The town erupted in conversation for days, some in awe, others in shame that none had stepped in sooner. But for Dave, the noise faded the moment they arrived at the estate. Not as a carpenter, not as a stranger, but as family. Samuel, who had arranged the legal transfer, handed Dave a thick leather-bound book the following week. Inside was every document affirming Jane and Jessica as the rightful heirs and Dave as their guardian. The mansion, with its long corridors and marble floors, echoed once again with the sound of children. Only this time, not in fear, but in freedom. Peter claimed an upstairs room with a view of the orchard. Jane and Jessica chose a chamber near the back, one with a secret nook and old wooden beams that reminded them of Dave's first home. The garden was cleared, the parlor cleaned, and the study, once dark with secrets, was turned into a quiet reading room filled with light and lace curtains. Dave didn't touch a coin of the girls' fortune for himself. Instead, he ensured their inheritance was placed in trust, managed by Samuel with regular records and protections. What he accepted, gladly, was the role of their father. They spent their mornings learning letters and numbers by the fire, and their afternoons running barefoot in the grass. On Sundays, they walked to church as a family. Peter with his slingshot tucked in his belt, and the girls in matching blue dresses made by the town seamstress. Years later, when people asked Jane and Jessica about the day their lives changed, they never spoke of the auction. They spoke of Dave, the quiet man with calloused hands and a carpenter's soul who saw two broken little girls and gave them a home, not made of stone or wealth, but of love. And so, in a house once ruled by shadows, laughter bloomed again, and they all lived, truly, happily ever after. If this story touched your heart, like, share, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more powerful soul-touching stories that restore faith in humanity.